Okay, well, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Well, thanks, Eric, for the introduction. With this mini session, I guess, I'm the only speaker in this part of the conference. So I've been sort of tasked to give a talk about stocking and climate change and, how stocking might affect the ability of populations to respond to climate change, and also whether stocking is a sort of a viable management option for humans to respond to climate change, or for salmon managers to respond to climate change. I'm going to address the issue with fairly broad brushstrokes, and I should say from the outset that I'm not going to present any data that's actually my own. I'm working with Phil McGinnity, so some of the data will be from the Burrish-Houle system. I've just joined the project, so I wasn't involved in that up until this point, and I'll also present some data from Alaskan sockeye. I did a postdoc before with Daniel Schindler in the University of Washington, Seattle, so I was sort of peripherally involved in that work. So just a brief talk outline. I'm going to give a brief overview of just the physical changes that we can expect with climate change. I think it's useful to just sort of go over those briefly and how they might affect salmon habitats. Then I'll talk about sort of signatures of these climate change, how they are translated into effects on salmon populations. I'll talk about, just briefly, the big, one of the major impacts of climate change, which is reduced marine survival. That's always in the background. Then I'll talk about freshwater impacts. I'll give a little bit of the case study from the Burrish-Houle, and then I'll sort of broaden the picture back again to talk about resilience of populations and stock complexes in the face of uncertainty, really. So the physical changes. So just go through these at the global scale first, just to kind of jog everyone's memory. So, what's all this climate change malarkey about? Well, it's driven by fossil fuels, greenhouse gases, of which CO2 is one of the most important. There are others, but if we look at the historical context, CO2 has always fluctuated in the Earth's atmosphere. But this graph here, I'm sorry if it's a bit small. This is the last 1,000 years, and you see that CO2, global average CO2 levels in the atmosphere, have fluctuated historically within fairly narrow bounds, about 280 parts per million. Here we are in sort of modern times, the blue here, and you can see that it's shot up, shortly after the Industrial Revolution, and then the green is sort of where we're going next. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have these scenarios that generate predictions based on a bunch of factors for what might happen. But the scary thing here, I got this from a recent paper in Science, is this is the sort of how much CO2 has fluctuated, the sort of band of variability during the Pleistocene, so the last 800,000 years. So we're already above that. And in the previous 15 to 20 million years, that's how much. So it has been higher in the past, but that was a very different Earth. And we're already topped 400 parts per million. So the sort of CO2 levels that we're currently seeing in the atmosphere, we haven't seen for about 15 million years. So the oceans are getting more acidic, pumping all the CO2 into the atmosphere, dissolves into the oceans. And there's a lot going on this graph, but just to direct your attention to, here we have hundreds of thousands of years ago. And this is a period of glacial cycles, interglacials, and you see that again, pH, ocean pH is it's fluctuated within relatively narrow bands. And here's what is predicted to happen in the future. So we're going way out of what's been experienced in the last, almost a million years. And that closely parallels CO2 in the atmosphere. In a recent State of the Ocean report, they were concluded that this is sort of unprecedented and we're entering an unknown territory of marine ecosystem change, exposing organisms to potential intolerable evolutionary pressure. So, temperature increases as CO2 in the atmosphere builds up, the greenhouse effect. Again, we have different time frames here. We have millions of years. Notice how the scale changes here. Thousands of years ago, end up into sort of years before present. So temperatures have always fluctuated. Yes, we've been through periods of the Earth's history where temperatures have been much warmer than they are today. But the point is they're changing at an unprecedented rate at the moment. And that's what organisms have to cope with. So, this is a scale here of millions of years. And you see, temperatures. This is all relative to the 20th century, late 20th century average. In the Pleistocene, you see that there's these glacials and interglacials, big swings in temperature, but changes on the timescale of hundreds of, or tens of thousands of years. And then here we are into the present day, up we go, and then this is what, depending on, what we do next, temperatures will continue to rise. So that's the sort of global average picture, but of course, climate change is manifested with a lot of regional variation. So there's a couple of patterns here to pick out. This is sort of an ensemble of various models and the late 21st century changes in temperatures around the globe. And here's the scale on the bottom going from 1 degree of change to, crazy temperatures. And a couple of patterns. The continents are warming faster than the oceans. Here's a sort of Atlantic salmon habitat. It's predicted not to warm maybe as much, at least the oceanic part of it. But then if you look a bit further north, that's another major pattern, is the northern, or at least high latitude regions of the world are going to warm much faster for various complicated reasons. And salmon up around Iceland, Greenland, they're going to venture into, that's part of their marine phase of the life history. So, how are, in general, then, how are species going to respond to these changes? Well, it's often reduced to these sort of simple moniker of move, adapt, or die. So, organisms can sort of move, both individuals can literally disperse, or the entire range of a species can sort of gradually shift as you lose populations at the southern part of the range, and maybe populations, there could be expansion at the northern part. Alternatively, species can sort of like stay put and adapt in situ, and that could involve things like physiological acclimation, phenotypic plasticity, or evolutionary adaptation. And if you can't do either of those things, extinction is the only alternative. So if we just think about movement, and there's loads of evidence so far that many species have shifted their ranges already in the late 20th century in response to, not that much warming so far. But this is a really interesting graph from a recent paper just showing the velocity of climate change. So this shows the speed with which organisms in general would have to move in order to track their current climate niche. So it's in kilometers per year. So if you're up here, you have to move at 32 kilometers per year in order to experience the same climate you historically experienced. So there's, again, massive regional variation. But one of the key take-home messages from this paper was that in loads of situations, organisms simply aren't going to be able to move that fast, or ranges aren't going to be able to shift that fast. So I think evolutionary adaptation is it's going to be required. So just put this up there to sort of mention that, so we have these underlying directional changes in the global climate, and that's manifested differently in different regions of the Earth. But overlaid on top of that, you have cycles, climate cycles, and there always have been and there always will be. So one very well-known one is the El Niño-La Niña oscillation. So here you can sort of pick out so-called El Niño years where actually global temperatures are a little bit higher than you would expect on average, and then the blue La Niña years, it's the opposite. And in 97, 98, there was a massive El Niño event with build-up of warm water in the tropical Pacific, and that just had huge repercussions for, Peruvian fisheries and heat waves around the world. And so that's all sort of part of a natural cycle, but it's overlaid on top of a trend. And, I just wanted to point out an interesting that I just read, this issue of attribution. If you have a sudden warm event, a heat wave, and you want to pin it, we would like to be able to say, well, was that climate change or not? Of course, it's a probabilistic thing. You can never say for sure, but the nice analogy I recently read was, imagine you had a cyclist who was pumped up on steroids. Now, just use your imaginations. Maybe that could happen. And that cyclist wins a race. So we want to say, well, did he win the race, or he or she win the race because he was pumped up on steroids? There's no way of knowing. Maybe they would have won the race if they weren't pumped up on steroids. But probabilistically speaking, there's a damn good chance that, cyclists on steroids are going to win more races. So I just thought it was a nice analogy with climate change anyhow. So I just put up this other oscillation in Pacific climate called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It's on a decadal scale of, I think it's 50 to 70 years. And I put it up there because it was actually coined, the term was kind of coined by salmon biologists, although, climatologists had been aware of this sort of cyclical behavior before. So it's a bit hard to see here, but this is data from a paper from Nate Manchua and others, and it shows catch in millions of various Pacific salmon species throughout the 20th century. And up here you have the PDO. So the PDO goes through these regime shifts, where here, for example, in 1977, 78, there was a shift to a positive phase. And this is reflected in the catches and the productivity of these Pacific salmon species. But really interestingly, it's sort of, if it's a positive phase, it's a good thing for Alaskan sockeye, but it's actually a bad thing for southern Chinook and coho populations. So from this paper, they had these interesting quotes where, from the 1939 yearbook, in 1939, the Bristol Bay sockeye run was regarded as the greatest in history. Same year, the catch in the lower Columbia, the Washington and Oregon of Chinook was one of the lowest in history. And then if you go to, let's say, 1972, so you're in sort of a negative phase of the PDO, and the Bristol Bay salmon run is a disaster, whereas down south in the lower 48, there were unexpected bonus when the large one of spring Chinook, it's one of the largest ones of spring Chinook. So it's interesting that changes in climate can have very different effects regionally. So climate change impacts on salmon. I just wanted to put up a sort of there's so many potential ways that climate can get filtered through local habitats and local landscapes to affect different types of life histories. But just put this up there as if you think about the marine environments, salmon spend part of their life cycle there, and you can have sort of abiotic effects, like direct effects of climate on the organism. And these are things like death due to high temperatures, increased energetic costs of migration, altered growth, maturation patterns. And then the biotic effects would, changes mediated through changes in the food supply. And that's the more sort of complicated, but potentially the more important impacts of climate change. And then similar things going on in the freshwater environments. I don't have time to kind of go through loads of different examples, but just to kind of, point out that there's loads of ways in which climate change could affect salmon. And I just picked out temperature stuff there, but of course there's changes in precipitation, which leads to changes in hydrology. And then salmon have to migrate between the two environments, and that's a critical transition, and climate change could influence the timing of that and the sort of the survival costs of hitting the ocean at the wrong time, for example. So there's two lovely papers, one by Johnson & Johnson in the Journal of Fish Biology that sort of outline a lot of these effects, and another one which is more sort of about the evolutionary consequences of climate change. It focuses on Pacific salmon, but it's all relevant to Atlantic as well. That's a really nice paper too. Before I go on to talk about stocking, just to point out, changes in ocean climate are a big factor for salmon on a sort of the scale of the North Atlantic. And this is a paper in Press by Friedland et al., and Phil was involved in that. But, we all know these, the declining patterns of abundance driven by reduced marine survival, affecting multi-sea winterfish more so than one-sea winterfish, but they're also affected, and, there's regional differences there. But it seems to be tied in really closely with the sort of the Atlantic version of the Pacific decadal oscillation. So this is the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And I won't explain this graph completely, but just to sort of, this is sort of, the blue is sort of an index of catch of salmon, and the red is an index of this AMO. And interestingly, for some reason, prior to the 20s, these things were sort of in phase, but now they're out of phase. Why that is, you can read this paper, it speculates on that, but it's a really, oceanic, atmospheric changes in oceanic climate, really have a big impact on salmon at sea. But what about freshwater impacts? What about stocking? So at a regional scale. So I just thought there was a nice quote from this report by the NASCO. It was, what was it called? The Salmon Summit. And so one of the messages to emerge from this meeting, I'm sure many of you were at it, was, to maximize the number of healthy wild salmon, if our goal is conservation and maximizing resilience of wild salmon populations, we need to maximize the numbers basically leaving the home rivers. And there's only limited opportunities to sort of further respond to these declines in marine survival through, fisheries closures or whatever. We've already closed a lot of the high seas fisheries. So really, we can do something about this, in freshwater. So just a few more nice little snippets from the report. So managing salmon in the face of uncertainty about future environmental changes will be challenging. We all know that. The goal should be, as stated, to protect the genetic diversity of wild stocks in order to maximize their potential to adapt to the changing environment. And consistent with a precautionary approach, where there's uncertainties, there's a need for caution. And the absolute priority should be to conserve the productive capacity of the resource. So we can all agree on these things in sort of general terms, but when it gets down to our individual rivers, you enter a much grayer area. So all about minimizing impacts in freshwater, where we have more direct control. So should stocking be a sort of part of the repertoire of management options, or do the risks outweigh the benefits? And like, as a disclaimer, like, I don't have an entrenched personal opinion on it. Like, I'm an evolutionary biologist, so I think more about the risks. But like, as Phil says, it's a societal issue, and we need to weigh up the risks and benefits in every specific situation. But I just want to talk, I suppose, focus a little bit more on the risks again, in the terms of, can salmon populations adapt to climate change, and will we help them adapt if we pump, stocked fish in, or will it compromise their ability to adapt? So resilience has been talked about a little bit already. So you can define it as, it can be defined at different levels, resilience. Like in the ecological literature, it's just defined as sustained productivity of whatever in the face of environmental changes. So I like to, break it down this way. You can think about it in terms of population resilience, and that's sort of like, can they resist extinction in the face of environmental change? And that's what we're genuinely interested in as salmon biologists. You can think about it at a slightly higher level, like what's the resilience of stock complexes? And I'm going to get to that towards the end, and Eric already touched on it with the Bristol Bay stuff. But, we can think of more holistically, resilience of entire ecosystems. What's the resilience of our, freshwater ecosystems, of which salmon are just one part? And they're related, but, there's subtly different questions to be asked at each of these levels. So, in terms of population or stock productivity, resilience, we're interested in abundance at the end of the day, or productivity, recruits per spawner. So this is a sort of another cartoon similar to the one that Phil showed, and David won't like it because it involves an extinction vortex. But yeah, just like Phil, I point out the extinction vortex thing. It's a long, it has a long-standing history in conservation biology. It didn't originate in that paper. So here we have the degree of local adaptation. So the match between phenotype and environment. And down here we have population abundance. So when we talk about like how is a population going to respond to the climate change, we need to be clear about, well, are we talking about trait responses, or are we talking about demographic responses? And the two are interlinked, although the link between the two is often more complicated than is appreciated. But if we just focus on both of these here, and let's say, just like Phil's slide, let's define perfect adaptation as this point. And in reality, populations will never be perfectly adapted. But as a starting point, let's say we have a population that's pretty reasonably well adapted to its local environments. And anything down here is increased maladaptation, a mismatch between the various phenotypes of that salmon population and the environment it lives in. So environmental change, we have something changes in the environment. It could be climate change, but in general we can think about this in terms of just environmental change in general. And here's two scenarios for what might happen just in terms of the adaptation, the degree of adaptation, or conversely of maladaptation of the population. So the top one is supposed to be a situation where the population can evolve itself out of trouble. And imagine, for whatever reasons, there's reduced genetic diversity. Here's a scenario where the population cannot evolve itself. It can't, I'm using that language liberally. I mean, evolution doesn't occur. So here we see this idea that, okay, the population starts to get more adapted because of this environmental change, but evolution, natural selection kicks in, and the match between phenotype and environment could be restored eventually. The corresponding changes down on the bottom for population abundance. So if you look at the dotted line, let's say no potential for evolution, the environment keeps changing, the population might decline to extinction. This is without any stocking now. This is just a sort of a generalized schematic. But this sort of curve here is the scenario where it could evolve itself, where evolution could kick in and potentially rescue the population. So, but as salmon biologists or managers, we come in and we see, okay, well, things are tanking. What are we going to do here? Are we going to just stand idly by and let the population decline to extinction? We don't know. We don't have the benefit of foresight to, maybe it'll evolve itself out of trouble. So forget about the non-evolutionary lines there. Let's just assume that there is some potential for evolution. So as a management response, we might stock. And let's say it's a continual stocking up until a certain point. For whatever reasons, we run out of funds, or the stocking stops at this point, but the environmental change, the rapid climate change, doesn't stop. So what are the consequences of that? Well, I think it's fair to say there's been enough evidence support presented from Kyle and from Eric and Phil's talks and others that chances are, if you're stocking the population, you're going to pull it off its local adaptive optimum, or you're going to make it, you're going to probably increase the level of maladaptation. It's not inevitable, but I think there are good arguments that it would happen. But what about the population numbers, which is what we care about in a lot of cases? Well, your stocking might not affect the numbers in the face of this change. So in that sense, it's been a good management response. And here I've shaded this in. You've sort of plugged this gap. Stocking is it's plugged that gap. And how is that a bad thing? And maybe you can do that in perpetuity, and that's not necessarily going to be a bad thing. But what happens if you stop stocking? And that was brought up by John, I think, as a question. And in Birchhoul, we'll talk about that in a minute, but I think there are good arguments to be made that if by stocking you have just pulled the population even further off its optimum than climate change has already been doing, and you stop stocking, well, climate change will continue. The population may or may not evolve itself out of trouble, but I think at that point, all of a sudden you have this, you've taken away the drugs, and all of a sudden now it's cold turkey, and the population could enter into an extinction vortex. Might not, but I think there are good arguments to be made that, it could. So the Birchhoul case study, Phil has already alluded to it, and as has Ken. So, just for those of you who don't know, this is where both Phil and I work, and this is Clew Bay in the west of Ireland. Lovely spot. And there's the ranching operation. Here's the hatchery operation. This is Loch Furnace, which is the brackish loch that Ken was talking about, where the smolts go in and then they go quickly out to sea. And then here's a Loch Fia, which is the freshwater lake. And it's a really unique situation because, they actually have two outlet streams here and total trapping facility. So great system to work in, both as a salmon biologist and in terms of experimental hatchery stuff. So there is this experimental hatchery, and Phil already showed this graph, but it's a closed system in terms of the brood stock, but for various reasons, some hatchery fish do get up and spawn in the wild. Whether they interbreed and integress, we're still working on that, but I think there's good reasons to believe they probably do. But the white, this is the same one that Phil showed. So anyways, here's the white, here's the proportion of the total sort of eggs in the wild that came from hatchery fish and from ranched fish. And so that's, there was changes in management here that went down, and then there's sort of changes in egg to smolt survival that parallel that. But just to delve a bit deeper into it, so Phil and others statistically built a statistical model to look at, what are the main factors that determine egg to smolt survival in the system? And to cut a long story short, these are the factors that sort of came out as being significant. So the number of hatchery eggs, the percentage of hatchery eggs in the spawning cohort was negatively correlated with total egg to smolt survival. There was also a negative effect of winter temperatures experienced by eggs and fry, so the first winter. Also a negative effect of winter temperatures in the second winter, so higher temperatures reduce survival. Lots of potential reasons why that might be. And then interestingly, there was a positive effect of winter temperature in the sort of final year of smolts. But crucially, there was this interaction between the percentage of hatchery eggs and winter temperature. So in years with a greater fraction of hatchery eggs, the negative effects of winter temperature were even stronger. So sort of Phil and others sort of ran with that, and first of all, there's been these observed changes in climate in the Birchhoul system. This is sort of, I think the blue shows the temperatures at Furnace, the loch there, and the other one shows the sort of all-Ireland picture, and they sort of closely track each other, but recently there's been this, fairly about a degree change in temperatures over the last 20, 30 years. So through using outputs from IPCC model scenarios and sort of downscaling them through a lake model to the system, They were able to come up with these sort of future projections for how, well, this shows the sort of European-wide scale for by the end of the 21st century how mean temperatures might change. But I'll just cut straight to some of their more results. So from this model, based on what was concluded from that regression model, and you kind of run it all forward. It's all linear, but you run it all forward under these scenarios, and under two scenarios of stocking, so either sort of escapes of ranched fish, either low percentage of ranched fish in the total breeding population or high. And you can see that you get these big differences. So in this, this is for one of the climate change scenarios, you get a reduction in egg to smolt survival throughout the 21st century, whereas with low levels of escapes, you get much, there's no decline in overall egg to smolt survival, which is interesting in itself because there are these negative effects of temperature, but when it all comes out in the wash, it doesn't seem to drive changes in egg to smolt survival in the absence of high levels of escapes. So this just sort of shows one of these model runs. I'll point to this one first is a scenario with low levels of escaped ranched fish in the wild, ticking along, and then here you have much higher levels, and you can see that there's reduction in the egg to smolt survival, and you get some potential. This is just one model run, but just to illustrate that there are some years where you could have zero egg to smolt survival. So there's lots of there are caveats to it. You're projecting linearly from previously historically observed trends. It might not be so linear, but the general message I think is that there's quite a bit of potential for the resilience of this population to be compromised by the addition of by more ranched eggs in the system. And whether they integress or not is another question that Phil has already talked about. So then I'll just finish off then with a couple of slides on, zooming up to a bigger picture of stock complexes. A lot of salmon populations are composed of these, there's structure and there's different populations within a given system. So I'm not going to talk about Atlantic salmon, but rather Bristol Bay sockeye again, and just because I think it's a really cool example, and it's relevant to climate change. So Bristol Bay in Alaska, sockeye salmon. There are these, I think is it 9 different major fishing districts in this sort of Bristol Bay complex. Salmon come back in huge numbers to each of these. It supports a really big fishery. Here's a picture of the front line. I think it's the Egagik district. Just carnage, for a couple of, I don't know how long the fishing season is, a month or so or 2 months, but big numbers of fish being caught. And if you zoom into more regional scales, you have these different lakes. This is just the Wood River system. You have these different lakes within the system. It's just up here. And each of these lakes then, if you zoom in even more, has all these different spawning populations. So you have this hierarchical structure to the system. And there's a ton of local adaptation and geographic differences in the system. So it's a really pristine habitat. I got to spend quite a bit of time up there when I was doing my postdoc in Seattle, and it's just the most wonderful area. How habitats might be free from the influence of humans, but it's a really diverse landscape. There's all this local adaptation. So, for example, there are beach spawners, lake beach spawners of sockeye, and there are these big sort of torpedo, deep-bodied fish, really morphologically quite different from those that spawn in small streams, and it all has to do with the balance between natural versus sexual selection, and bears are a big selective pressure. And you get all this age diversity within a given spawning population. You've got age diversity. And the landscape is, it's this shifting mosaic of suitable habitats, which is just really interesting. In some years, here you have through depositional processes or whatever, this particular creek is blocked off, a beaver dam is built, no salmon get up there in that year. Low flows, the salmon get stranded. All of this disturbance is part of the natural run of things. So if you look at the commercial catches, and there's really good data on this of sockeye salmon in Bristol Bay as a whole over the last 120 years, and broken down by fishing districts. So you can't read the things there, but in the early part of the century, the whole system was really a Naknek Kwijak system. Those river fish predominated. And then you get, these spikes and whatever. And then in more recent times, all of a sudden these other stocks start to do really well. So Egagik is the yellow one. Back then, no one would have thought that Egagik would produce big numbers of fish, producing massive numbers of fish now. And it's tied in with this PDO, so that just shows the PDO at the bottom, and here you have the regime shift from a negative to a positive phase of the PDO, which has been good for Alaskan sockeye, record catches in the last couple of years, so in a way, that's a climate cycle, but it's potentially going to change with climate change. But the key point is that there's sort of different river systems and don't respond coherently to the same climate drivers. And within each river system, different spawning populations don't respond. So you have this biocomplexity. And it just buys you this resilience. So this is a paper from Daniel Schindler recently. And it just shows, okay, so here we have the number of returning salmon in millions, like 30 million, is the average over the historical periods. And let's say you have an intact portfolio. You have all this geographic variation, age, structure, all the rest of it. Now, it's a fixed escapement policy that the ADF&G operates. So if there's less than 10 million fish to the whole system, there's fisheries closures. So in the past, this is just a run from a model, but it reflects real dynamics. In the past, you'd have about 4 fisheries closures, per 100 years, on average, based on the dynamics of the system. And you would have some years with massive peaks. But if you eroded that portfolio of all this biocomplexity, and I don't have time to go into the details of, just take my word from it, if you could erode that, you're going to get more volatile dynamics. So here's what would happen if you lost all of that structure and all of that age diversity. The fisheries will be closed 40 times every century. So that's a massive economic loss to the region. And also you get these huge spikes where actually you can go above capacity, and that has problems too. But the point is just that there's this inbuilt resilience. And the stability and the productivity of the whole system derive from diverse and changing habitat. So environmental heterogeneity is sort of the template that produces local adaptation and gives rise to these diverse portfolios of life histories. And compare this, I know it's an extreme comparison, but compare Bristol Bay, Alaska, all this beautiful intact habitat with, say, the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, California, where, there's so many impacts compounded on top of each other, dams, impoundments and habitat loss and all the rest of it, and massive hatchery programs. So, biocomplexity has been massively eroded in the Pacific Northwest, so how is that compromising the stocks? And the big question with stocking, I think, is, in individual situations, I think it can be justified, but for me, there's a wider philosophical question about should we be tinkering so much, And surely, measures that improve habitat and try to maintain diverse, dynamic landscapes will pay larger dividends in the long run. And, hatcheries might foster increased homogeneity. So, but that was a nice quote from Aldo Leopold, about this precaution stuff. You to keep every cog in the wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. So I'll just finish with this. I just put it up there. It's a golden toad, and it's been sort of propounded as the first extinction of a species that can be linked to climate change, recent climate change. Now, it's very hard to attribute an extinction to climate change, but this is one of the best cases out there in the Monteverde cloud forests. And Alan Pounds, who has been studying amphibians in the system, I like this because part of the problem for these, the proximate reason for the extinction was disease, which is going to be a big thing in salmon as well in a warming world. So his quote is, "Disease is the bullet that's killing the frogs, but climate change is pulling the trigger." And then he goes on to say that global warming is wreaking havoc on amphibians and is going to be soon to cause staggering losses of biodiversity. And so captive rearing programs are being really considered for amphibians. But, at the end of the day, are you going to be increasing the genetic load on these populations and maybe making the problem worse? Well, there's lots to figure out there, but I'll just kind of leave you with that rhetorical question. So I'd just like to thank the organisers. I'd like to thank Daniel for providing me with slides, and Phil for slides and fantastic discussions always, and the Beaufort programme for my funding. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm sure that'll stimulate a lot of thought. Any immediate questions? Ted?
Hi, yes. You showed a slide of the Burishal, the change in survival rate of Burishal fish with proportion reared. It's the same slide, I think, that Phil showed once or twice. I let Phil get away with it, but I'm getting concerned that we're seeing it several times as a demonstration of an effect, which I'm not convinced by. It appears to me that the proportion reared was reduced sometime after you started seeing an increase in the survival, when you should have seen, presumably, the increase in survival occurring a year or so after the reduction in proportion reared. I wonder if you're actually being fair in this interpretation, and maybe you can blame it on Phil if it wasn't your fault.
So the regression analysis sort of tried to account at the same time for changes in temperature. You know, the effects of temperature at different periods on the egg to smolt survival, in addition to the numbers of proportions.
I don't think we're talking about the same slide.
Well, no, but that's based on the same data. Sorry.
I mean, maybe it is that you weren't showing the full analysis, but it's as presented. I don't think it's.
So that's the regression analysis.
That one. That's the one, yeah.
But it's based. I mean, this is the data from the population on which, the regression analysis is based. So the analysis asks how, variation in year to year in egg to smolt survival, what predicts it? And I know I take your point that, you'll already have this reduction going on there. But, winter temperatures affect it, and they've been going up. So yeah, maybe that's been driving an increase in egg to smolt survival. But in the model, it's only a correlative model, but the effect of the number of the proportion of these ranched fish in the system comes out as a significant factor, and with an interaction with temperature. So yeah, I mean, we're basing conclusions on statistical models of data, which is what everyone does. But I think there were a load of good arguments. I'll pass maybe on to Phil for.
Well, I think, Ted, like that was just the raw data when we started off. What does it look like? What does, there's a phenomenon. The model is something, we incorporate that data.
Take the mic, Phil.
We incorporate that data plus the environmental data plus the whole thing together to build the model. But that was just, in fact, it was looking at that originally, we kind of go, geez, there's something strange going on there. And I think Ted, yourself, and myself have worked soldier and stock and recruitment relationships and so on in the past, where we've been trying to get a grip of what type of depression of production or the stock and recruitment relationship might be affected by this type of phenomenon. And I think Kyle's slide then with Reisenbeckler's, that idea of a depression of the stock and recruitment function. Now, it's not an easy thing to get across or to understand, but it took, we were interpreting the Burishal stock and recruitment relationship as, in the ascending leg of the relationship, rather than maybe some asymptote or subsequent to that. If that makes any sense.
I'm not entirely sure what the friendly criticism is. I mean, like if you're saying this drop precedes the changes in egg to smolt survival?
I'm saying it follows. I'm saying it was 2000 when you reduced the proportion reared, and yet
the proportion reared was
the other way around, yeah. Yeah, no, I take your point. Sorry, the other way around.
No, I accept the fact that behind it a more complex model.
Yes.
Neither of you actually Phil didn't explain that.
Well, it was just it was for illustrative purposes.
Wow, I think there's always a danger in eyeballing time series and trying to conclude what's going on from them. But.
Okay, Jamie, you had the next question.
Tom, thanks for a very nice talk. I was listening quite intently, and I noticed in the middle you said that as you're an evolutionary biologist, and as an evolutionary biologist you didn't necessarily have an opinion as to whether stocking was good or bad. I would say that being an evolutionary biologist doesn't excuse you from having an opinion.
What I said was I don't have an entrenched opinion.
An entrenched opinion. My wife suggests I have too many opinions on many things, so I'd just make a point, which is a question, which is organisms speciate and undertake major adaptations through mutation and then upregulation of those mutations. And you did a great job, I think, of showing us that the speed of change is going to happen far too quickly for our species of interest here to be able to adapt via mutation. And I saw a really nice paper on that some years back where they tried to look at phylogenetic response for conservation. Anyway, off the point. So basically the species is going to have to cope with what it's got and then rely on the diversity of what it's got. And I would say, as an evolutionary biologist, we as fellow evolutionary biologists should be highlighting the fact that the species would be better able to cope with change, and we know that change will come, but we don't know the full nature of the way that change will impact or which genes will be useful. Yeah. So preserving the biodiversity, I think, is the key to maintaining this portfolio to allow adaptation. And Phil's paper did a nice job of showing how the hatchery process, and we've seen other evidence, will upregulate and magnify certain parts of the genome, and we may and reduce diversity, and we may get lucky, and we may breed a hatchery stock where that diversity is magnified. Yeah. That just gets lucky and prepares us for climate change, but I don't think that's going to be the case. So I would say, as an evolutionary biologist, we should be sounding the horns for maintenance of biodiversity, and if that means making a statement that wouldn't support of stocking, then we should make that statement.
Yeah, no, I take your point. I mean, from the scientific camp, we don't want to be rendered sort of like useless in the debate. All I meant by that statement was just, I think you'll find that evolutionary ecologists, geneticists, they're very open-minded about it. It might come across as having entrenched opinions. It's just because when you work on these things for a long time, you really see that these things are important. So I just meant to say, I agree with Phil that I think stocking, it's a societal, it's a socioeconomic problem which biologists have have a part to play, but there are many other voices that need to be heard as well. But can I come just on one thing you said there about the speed of adaptation, and it's true that in many cases, like, the pace of climate change will probably just outstrip the capacity for evolutionary adaptation, but it might not be universally true, and we're already seeing evolutionary responses in some organisms. And they have all these, for example, experiments. Now, it's just lab experiments, but they're called evolutionary rescue experiments, where you can change the environment of a lab organism, and you can see can it respond, and you can see if you get these sort of things going on. And actually, that in yeast and stuff like that, it's driven by mutation. So mutation is probably a limiting factor in wild vertebrates, but it's not necessarily out of the equation. But standing variation would probably be more important.
You showed various graphs of declines of fitness. It's very nice showing a graph of decline of fitness, but there's going to be a point on that decline of fitness when the population becomes non-viable. We've got very harsh conditions at the moment in the recent context out of the marine conditions, so we've got to maximise our production in the density-dependent portion of the life cycle. Have you modelled what is the decline of fitness that's required before the biosaur population becomes non-viable?
Say the last bit again.
What is the point at which the decline in fitness would render the biosaur population non-viable?
Well, I mean, you can only really address that, I think, with a population viability analysis, where you build in density dependence into the demography, and you just perturb it, and you ask at what levels of reduced productivity in given life stages does stochastic extinction risk increase to the point. But I can't give you a black and white answer. Sorry.
David.
In your discussion, you talked about the MAD, move, adapt, or die. Salmon are actually probably not very good at moving, despite being migratory, because of their homing behaviour. Is there scope for stocking programs to actually shift populations northwards, or shift parts of populations northwards, so that they would be in conditions further north that they were finding further south? I suspect the answer may be no, because it's going to be too darn complex to know what exactly it is that's driving this. But there might be scope for investigating.
Assisted migration. I mean, Phil touched on it, and they're talking about this a lot in forestry, for example, where there's big commercial implications of whether tree species can track changes in their climate. But I mean, there's scope for it, but I would just be inherently kind of uneasy about it just because of all of the risks involved. But I suppose that has to be weighed up against, well, if we truly believe that they can't adapt fast enough and they can't shift their ranges fast enough, then I guess it should be on the table, but for proper, cost-benefit analysis type stuff. Personally, I think just the safer approach is just to let nature do its thing. I mean, well, stop pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere would be a good starting point. But I think these are bandages on a bigger wound.
We had a question in the back there. Yeah.
Back in your presentation there, maybe I misunderstood, but you were talking about the effect of the effect on a population size of withdrawing the stocking program after it has already begun. Mm. And given that there are a number of river systems that have been traditionally supported by stocking programs, the sort of broad message is that stocking is genetically unfavored, that it is uneconomic, but people like myself who may have to make a decision to close these things, are you saying that if I close them, I'm going to get this vortex that we talk about?
No, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I was just, the schematic just helps us to sort of think about how these processes work and interact. But yeah, I mean, in specific situations where you already have a stocking program, there's all sorts of hidden resiliences to populations that we don't understand. So maybe if you stop stocking, maybe things will just revert to an ancestral state pretty quickly. Maybe, and the link, I want to stress that the link from maladaptation to, the abundance of populations, it's not, there's a lot we need to figure out there. But I think Phil kind of nicely highlighted, regardless of changes in abundance, I think you would have really changed the character, the type of fish is different now than it was before. And that should be part of from a broader perspective. Do we want to...
To put you on the spot a little bit more, say for example, in an imaginary situation that you had maybe the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, maybe even the 10th generation of stocked fish as your primary population in a river system. If you stop that process, what do you suggest might happen?
What do I suggest might happen to the wild fish if they're still...
To the whole fish population structure.
Well, I put up the schematic as here's what could be quite likely if you really maladapted the stock through the stocking process and if the environment has changed. But I think you're fishing for specifics that are very difficult to give answers to. I know that's an evasive answer as well, but I mean, I think all bets are off. I think that's the point. The point is that in a changing climate, with not just directional changes but greater uncertainty, all bets are off. And I think if you take the bigger picture, I think humans can be a little bit arrogant to think that we'll just fix it. We'll just plug that hole. We'll plug this hole. Bandage here, bandage there. I mean, would a better strategy, thinking bigger, would not be to just promote resilience of ecosystems? And
I think from your answer, the only thing I would say is you spent a lot of time with Phil.
What's that?
I think from your answer, all I would say is you spent a lot of time with Phil.
He rubs off you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Phil.
Maybe an illustration of this. I give a slide near the end of my talk was about, it's the relative size of the intervention, the hatchery program and so on. Just to give you a little story, when I started in the fishery board force up in the Northern Board, I was based up in the hatchery. I'd be doing some protection, but I'd be doing some hatchery work in the winter. And John Gallagher at the time was the hatchery manager, and he used to send myself out and a few lads out to different rivers with buckets of eggs. And I'd have, for the Owenye River, which has probably got 7,000 or 8,000 fish pond, I would go out with a bucket of 5,000 eggs. That was a big program, 5,000, and I'd have a pipe, and we'd dig at the grave and I'd put the pipe in and put the eggs in. And then I'd go another bucket over to the Lennon, which probably has 3,000 or 4,000 fish, and I go, like the 5,000 eggs is the progeny of one fish, one hen. It's a hatchery program, and on the records, it is a hatchery program. And if you close the hatchery program, which it is now, But I thought I was doing the devil and all. You know, it really was, you know, something big. And when you talk to the punters, then, you know, we put 10,000 fish into the Swelly there, lads. Oh my, that's just magnificent. Like, we're going to get 10,000 fish back or whatever it was. But really, you know, and it was only 2 fish, you know. So, and then I was asked then once then to go to a meeting on the mask. And the mask is absolutely, you know, I know any of you fish the mayfly or whatever. I don't know, they probably kill 10 or 15,000 fish that week or 2 weeks on the mayfly. Would that be right, lads? Something like that. So I was asked to come to give a talk about some of this stuff to the angling club in Ballinrobe. It was a set-up from Michael Kennedy at the time. He said, just come and talk to these lads. And I started into this stuff, this rubbish that I'd be going on with. And one fellow was just, his eyes just glazed over. And I says, you know what the hell I'm talking about? He said, I have no idea what you're talking about, son. So I said, all right, fair enough, let's go to a different time. And Martin O'Grady was there at the time. And he said, well, the way I see it is, if you caught half the fish you caught in the river, that would be the equivalent of 20 hatcheries, or a quarter, or whatever. So it's relative to the size, the intervention. So if you turn around, even the Burrishool there, and Dave was asking about, even a change there, like, it was still only, you know, some years could be big, but 10 or 15 or 20%. Like, it's just, to have a real influence, you know, it's about scale. So the bigger the intervention, and the smaller the recipient population, the bigger the risk. You know, to do something in the Moy or do something else, like, you know, it's just infinitesimally small. So I think that's what you need to think about. It's not about closing a hatchery or opening a hatchery, whatever it is. You know, that's the risk is relative to the size or the status and so on, all those factors that I put out. And that's why I put that slide in, because I thought that question would come up. You know, how much risk are we taking? So when I was going around my book of 5,000 eggs, what was the risk compared to one of these big Hood River programs where somebody was telling me, it was last night, 5 billion or 4 billion hatchery smolts, 4 billion hatchery smolts are released into the wild. You know, compared to my bucket of eggs, although at the same time my bucket of eggs could have been carrying Gyrodactylus cereris. I guess that thing that happened in Norway was with a bucket of eggs or some smolts or something of that size. And look at the trouble that's there. The veterinary institute there in Norway, that must be costing them, that intervention, that gene banking that they go on must be 20, 30, 40 million euro a year program. So as a state official, that wasn't very good cost-benefit relationship. I don't know what all that balderdash there was any help to you, John, but I think that's the way you have to think about it.
Can I just add, Ken Whelan yesterday talked about, what's the name of it, Ken, this sort of model or website where you can kind of go in and just do the numbers game.
We haven't put a name on it yet, but it's basically it's a web tool to give people a feel for working through the software and seeing the consequences of their action.
Well, it could be really useful to have something similar where, you know, for your specific system, you want to kind of put numbers on things, and with something like that, you could, you know, just play the scenario game where you say, let's say, because you've maladapted the population, you've reduced egg to smolt survival by X%. Okay, now what happens if it stays at that level after we remove the stocking? You know, and you just go through the numbers, and because there's density dependence and like, stock dynamics are complicated, so I think it's fair to evade those types of questions. What's going to happen to my stock? You know, you need to do the numbers, and as Phil says, it's in proportion to the intervention, the size of the population. So, yeah.
There's actually a relevant literature, and I mean the best example that I know is on the Oregon coast. There were lots of coho streams, some of which had hatcheries, and the Oregon coastal coho were listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So the first thing Oregon Fish and Wildlife did was close the hatcheries to remove that threat. And so they had pre-data for populations with and without hatcheries, and then they had post-data for those same populations after the hatcheries had closed. And closing those hatcheries, the productivity of those populations rose fairly quickly. And you can also see from the plot that both Phil and I have showed in the rapidity of evolutionary response when you take wild fish into the hatchery. Presumably, when you take them out, in quotes, that response will be similarly fast. It'll be a bit slower, probably. In addition to those examples, there are also examples of fairly rapid evolution with transplantations. So sockeye salmon from British Columbia to Lake Washington near the University of Washington. And those sockeye diverged in run timing, body shape, mating, all sorts of things within a handful of generations. Chinook salmon taken from California to New Zealand, similarly, run timing, body shape, life history, a handful of generations. So if there's some genetic diversity, and if the natural selection is strong enough, it's pretty quick. It's pretty quick. We always think of evolution as this long, long process. But they get stuck in those genes.
I think not to hog the floor, and I will hand the mic over now, but I think as a fishery manager, the broad brush message from here is stocking is unfavored, it's uneconomic, etc., etc. But then to throw in that, well, if you stop, you might lose your population. Leaves me with a little bit of confusion, but I'll just leave it at that, and maybe I'll have a row with some of you that maybe over lunchtime or whatever, you know.
Can I just add one little tiny bit on that? I think the things that you've mentioned are really good, and the reason that confusion is being left is because there's one important point that hasn't, I guess, been put together to get the picture. If you're worried about stopping stocking, so as Kyle says, if your stocking is what your pressure is that's depressing the productivity, and you stop stocking, then your population will respond and bounce back. However, if your stocking is doing as what, sorry, is it Tom?
Yeah.
Said on that graph, if it's plugging a gap, and so you're almost, it is working in that the fish you're catching are the ones that you're stocking, so you're plugging a gap, and if you stop that, your population will decline. If you haven't addressed the issue that is causing your population to decline. Yeah. So that's the difference. If your stocking is one of your main problems, that's the pressure, whereas if your stocking is filling that gap and you're not addressing the other problems, then yes, you could go down if you stop stocking, and that could cause a problem because you've not addressed the other problems. And I think that hopefully might help you complete the picture.
Yeah, no,
that's
really well put, actually, and thanks for clarifying.
No, that's fine. It's just everyone getting really confused, and it's about why.
I didn't mean to say let's say in the absence of climate change, if you stop stocking, everything's going to go tits up. Like I meant. In the presence of these other stressors like climate change, exactly as this lady's just verbalized, you might make the maladaptation worse by your stocking program, and therefore the potential recovery of the population post-stocking might be compromised. That was only the point. That's the point. And
it's really, really difficult because you guys get put on the spot, and each case is different, and you do have to look at, whether your stocking is just masking the problem and you haven't done anything to remove the other pressures. And if you haven't, then yes, you could go back to down having no fishery.
Okay, this will be our last question here, and then we'll convene for lunch.
Thank you. Surely there'll come a time with climate change and with the increase in temperatures that our rivers will be beyond survival with wild stocks, and we may have to look at restocking as the only way forward to protect what we have left, the species, in fact.
So we might lose, because of climate change, populations here?
That's right.
So we put fish back in. But how are they going to persist in the warmer rivers?
We've got to look at the economic benefits that they bring to communities. The wages that they bring to communities. A fisherman wants to catch a fish. Yeah. The community hotel wants that fisherman to catch a fish. The local petrol station wants that fisherman to catch a fish, and so on and so on and so on. Yeah. So you've got to provide that angler, as an angler, you've got to provide that angler with what he wants to benefit the community he's in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not against that per se. It's not a black and white either or. I just think that would have to be weighed up against a whole lot of other socio-economic issues. And, salmon are not the only fish in the river. And someone put it yesterday, maybe we're just small fry in this whole debate, I mean, there are other, if you introduce salmon back into a river that's so warm, there are other ecological consequences of it. And I'm just trying to, I think just verbalizing the risks and the benefits. But I totally take the point that there are these very valid benefits for local communities, for anglers that need to be considered as well.
And finally, can I just ask Johannes, if we all get a bulk booking, will he give us a discount?
Hopefully. Okay, I think all those discussions are going to continue over lunch, I'm sure. So thank you to all our speakers this morning and to the audience.